Hi, welcome back to part 2 of episode 89, where we dwelt into 101 of neuroscience. A conversation in neuroscience is incomplete without a conversation about consciousness and the metaphysical aspect of our human experience. So we get into that. This is an exploratory conversation, and this is an evolving space. So hopefully you enjoy it. You get a time to reflect on it, and maybe if you see something yourself from your experience, let us know. Share your experience below in the comment section. If you like the work in this channel, please do remember to subscribe, hit like, and leave your comments. This episode is also available on all major podcast platforms. Let's dig in. Welcome back. We spent close to an hour talking about the substrate, the physiology of the brain, and I thought now let's spend some time around some more metaphysical concepts and ideas that have been around in the world and how they're kind of intersecting with what neuroscience is finding. So, for example, let me start with consciousness. What is consciousness? There is a view that's out there on the philosophy, in the the metaphysical, spiritual side of things. Um, I want you to throw some light on how you look at it from a neuroscience perspective, and then maybe we'll just kind of converge it with what you're also seeing on the metaphysical side.
Sure. Okay, we dove in head first, I guess, into the more complex issues. Okay, what is consciousness? Man, it's something beyond the material realm. I think that the origin of it, I personally ascribe to the model that's provided in Hinduism, in seeing consciousness as a derivative of the spirit. And the reason I say that is because I spent all my life studying neuroscience, and it has been really difficult, virtually impossible for me to put my finger on any part of the physical substrate that will comprise consciousness. And I think the easiest sort of example I can give is that when I was in the cadaver lab, there was a dead body there. One moment there's somebody alive, and the other moment there's somebody dead. Almost in a sort of fraction of a second, and sometimes for reasons that we have no idea. Actually, most of the cases when people pass, we don't know what causes random things to stop. There's changes. Once we say, okay, well, it's a change of biochemical events that then sees it to change. I mean, I was like, okay, we're just using complex words to explain really nothing. There's complex biochemical change that's happening in our body right now, but why are we not dying? And so there's a sort of experiential part of consciousness that's very hard to define. And I think that the only model that really provides an answer as to why instead of how. See, science, I think, provides a lot of answers for how things may happen, but doesn't really provide for why it may exist. We have to turn to more spiritual answers. And so I believe that we are a spirit, and that the spirit is experiencing certain things, and that's what really gives us this ability to experience everything that we are able to experience. Beyond that, it's hard for me to define at this stage.
So let's zoom in from a neuroscience point of view.
Sure.
So I'm in the tech industry, right? And I'll kind of correlate to what's going on in artificial intelligence, right? Now, what are we doing in artificial intelligence? We are actually replicating what you've been describing on how the brain works in a silicon substrate, right? So same. There is a neural network. There are silicon. There are nodes in the substrate, and they're being trained to talk to each other. Nowhere near the complexity that a human brain is where today, but the thinking is that in the next 30, 40, 50 years,
Mm-hmm.
the same level of complexity will get created on a silicon substrate,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So what I want to come back to is from a science point of view. When you say consciousness, is consciousness just electrical connections? I mean, or like I know you're saying that from a spiritual perspective, but
Yeah. Yeah.
but
Yeah.
how do you know that, in the sense, um, what if it is just a bunch of electrical connections that you call as consciousness? When it's
Yeah.
on, you're conscious. If it's off, you're not conscious.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, I think that, well, I think there was a couple experiments done in neuroscience. I can't remember the exact name, but I can get you the reference for them later. But a very interesting set of experiments done on humans where they were doing actually deep brain stimulation studies for human patients.
Hmm.
And the idea of the idea of these surgeries were actually to relieve symptoms of Parkinsonian symptoms, and the idea was that to keep them from flailing their arms and legs and whatnot. So they would go in there and they would basically electrically ablate, like they would remove certain cell populations and hopefully relieve that sort of those sort of symptoms. And so they were doing that on one patient, and you know um, they were asking a series of. Usually, when they do these kinds of surgeries, the person's still awake because they want to
Hmm.
make sure that removing core components of their brain. Actually, our brain doesn't have any uh, actual physical brain. If you touch it, it doesn't have any. You can't feel anything because you don't have the senses to feel anything there,
Hmm.
right? So if you touch the brain, you won't feel anything. Obviously, the layers, our scalp and stuff, it has a lot of neurons. But if you go and touch our physical mush, nothing there. I mean, not gonna feel anything. So ask you a series like, hey, can you, like, are you still awake? Yeah. Are you still? Can you move your right hand? They'll move right hand. Can you move your right leg? Move right leg. And then the neurosurgeon basically uh, stimulates a certain part, and then he says he says he stimulates it, and his right hand moves, and the patient asks him, like, did you move your right hand? And he was like, no, you moved my right hand. And so he moves his right leg, and he's like, okay, he stimulates, his right leg is moved, and then neurosurgeon asks the patient, did you move your right leg? He said, no. And the patient replies, no, you moved my right leg. And so there's
Hmm.
this dissociation that emerges from that, this idea of, like, who are we?
Hmm.
And I think oftentimes, how do we tease apart, are we just electrical signals, or are we something different from that? Is that
Hmm.
there's oftentimes a dissociation between our physical body and who we are. It's hard to answer from the brain's perspective, but if we were to chop each part of our body off and leave with just like a stump, we would still
Hmm.
be the same person. Um, and you can even remove certain parts of the brain, and yes, parts of the personality change, but uh, you will find that I think there are certain core components of somebody's persona who are still there.
Hmm.
And the way that I've always seen it is, I believe that the brain is just, it's a computer. Like we kind of discussed this before, that it's a map for us to have our experiences.
Hmm.
And this is impossible to prove. And I guess if we were to prove this, I think it would, the consequence would go beyond a Nobel Prize.
Hmm.
But I mean, it's very hard to decipher. One thing I wanted to quickly note is that even if in machine learning we were able to create a system that we can perfectly recreate this aspect we call consciousness.
Hmm.
Um, some people are like, okay, then we've proved that we can recreate consciousness. That indeed these nodes and interconnections are the source of sort of our core being. But I would posit a different model wherein I think that in creating such a synthetic system, we actually we've then created a vessel. I think we've created a vessel for something higher to actually take form into that being. So, for example, but the thing is that it's going to be a very jarring experience, I think, for that spirit soul, because all of a sudden you've created this nidus, and all of a sudden it takes form. Whereas if you think about humans, we go through this. I think this is why the idea of human birth and childhood is so important, because we're brought into this life in this sort of very cherishing and loving. And even if a child is brought up with a lot of trauma, there's still a level of care that's associated with rearing this this being into the world. So I think that in the future, when we create artificial intelligence systems where like we're able to, where consciousness inhabits that form in a heartbeat, I believe that it's actually a real consciousness. It could be a spirit soul, but it's inhabiting it right now and right then and there, and it's going to be an arguably difficult transition, if you will. But we'll see.
Well, yeah. So there's also the other aspect of the sense of self, right? So there is. So from what I've read and heard, so there is one level of consciousness where you're looking at just a pure idea that something is aware of its existence, or can experience something. Like, what's the difference between a rock and a tree? A tree. Let's say a tree has a certain level of experiencing, taking some stimuli and responding to it, so it's alive. So there is some level of consciousness in its cells, versus a rock, which is not conscious at all. So that's one level of differentiation we can talk about, right? At a level of life. The other is a sense of self. So the idea that I'm aware of myself. That's another view of consciousness, of self-awareness. So in the area of AI, there are things like Turing test and stuff like that, where people are saying that in the future the AI algorithms are going to be able to continue to learn and at some point be self-generative. So what I'm saying is that, are you just that additional memory that's been put on the substrate? And if you took that away, those patterns away, then are you still there? I mean, these are questions that are getting debated as we speak on the AI space, because are you just a pattern? If my pattern is taken out, am I still me?
Yeah. So sorry, finish. We want to finish what you were going to say.
Yeah, so I was thinking about where is neuroscience about some of these ideas. Does neuroscience just look at the brain and say, hey, these are the bunch of electrical patterns that are there, so that's you, but we don't know what's beyond that. It's beyond the scope of neuroscience? Or is neuroscience beginning to say there's something more to it than just those patterns in someone's
Yeah. I mean, again, like I said in the beginning of the last talk, that neuroscience does take a relatively reductionist approach, in the sense that, like, if you ask a very fundamental neuroscientist, they would say that we are only we. So it all depends on what you describe as us. So I think the question that you're asking is I guess what we're trying to say is what is consciousness? And that's exactly, it's really hard to define. It's that neuroscience would say that you as me as Shrinath and you as Santosh are indeed a series of interconnections between different nodes in our brain. So yes, theoretically that, and there's been many proofs for this. Like I said, if we remove certain parts of the brain, or if we stimulate certain parts of the brain, we can remove certain parts of someone's identity or someone's memory, and then we can put it back, especially in animal models, and recreate that. And arguably, you can then, take this set of information, map it onto a biosynthetic platform, and recreate this. So using those kinds of evidence, one could argue that. But I think that if you start to see things a little differently, so what if you define the self as the sort of electricity that passes through your neurons? What if you're not the actual neurons themselves, but you're the energy that sort of permeates through the system, because it's not just this idea of me talking to you and stuff like that.
Yeah.
We know that in the laws of thermodynamics is that energy and matter can't be created or destroyed. It's just transformed. So what if we define we in a little bit more abstract sense as to you and I? Because these kinds of things we are able to see. We're able to create form out of virtually nothing. How are humans born? How are we brought into this thing from a single cell? So single cells operate in this way. They don't have the super complex construct of nodes and internodes and whatever. Yet that's exactly where we come from. Two cells. And so, and then once we pass, we go back into this earth, and we then constitute, we constitute the material which makes this form, and then that gets taken up by a different form of life, like a tree. A tree then dies, and then we constitute this whole planet. So like, I think that the question is we have to really define what we is. And if we kind of limit it, and this is a neuroscience perspective, then neuroscientists will tell you that it's limited to this brain, this thing called this architecture, this neural architecture. But if you start to step away and look back, are we the magnetic fields? Are we the electricity? Are we the experience itself? Are we the experience itself? Like, forget about, if we remove anything that we can measure. And what is that? Because I think those are the kinds of questions that neuroscience cannot answer, because neuroscience by definition is not that.
Yeah.
So, and I think limiting yourself to that definition is dangerous, particularly within, like I said, things like psychology and psychiatry, where we try to throw drugs and we try to throw sort of interventions, and we try to reduce the experiences, human experiences, to just plain brain activity, when we really don't know what the cause of someone's real problem is. For example, like if someone's having problems at home with their significant other, and they come into the clinic and we find out that they're depressed, the problem isn't that there's something's wrong with their brain, there's something's wrong at home. It's a human experience. It has nothing to do with the brain. Obviously, there's other instances where somebody may have something intrinsically different about their brain. And this is some of the challenges that we face in neuropsychiatry. But those are just a couple of topics I want to touch on. I don't know if that kind of made sense.
No, that makes a lot of sense. I think you touched the chord, right? When you said the distinction between, are we the neurons or are we the energy that powers the neurons? I think that sums up the way the world of neuroscience and where the metaphysical probably separates. And kind of making it real and practical in day-to-day life, right? This podcast is about endurance and running and fitness, and also bridging the realms of the physical and the metaphysical. So the question is, for example, if you want to go and climb Mount Everest, just as and you've never done it before, there is no past memory of you having done Mount Everest. Yes, you commit to it and train. So you're training yourself, so that's fine. But who is making that first commitment of something that's never been done before? Like never, ever. I've gone to a mountain, or maybe swimming in the ocean. Never swam in my life before. Who or what is committing or suggesting that go and experience the water?
Exactly.
And I think that's the realm of energy. And because it was not done before, it doesn't come from a past history of having swam in the waters all the time, nothing like that, right?
Absolutely.
So that's the realm of energy. And so that's fascinating. I think that's where you hit the nail. And in my last podcast, I had a cardiologist, a doctor. He's also an energy medicine, energy healer. So he was talking about how health is, you need to look at health from a multimodal perspective, and one of them is energy balance. So if you're not well, then energy is out of balance, and then so you do different things to bring energy back.
Absolutely.
Or even things like Reiki, where you're healing people remotely through energy.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So I think what you said is perfect. It just nailed it. Just very
Oh, yeah.
nicely creates that separation of where something like neuroscience ends and where metaphysical starts.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, the funny thing is that I think that a lot of scientists, they have trained so hard in their entire lives, and because of their training and their sort of limited exposure, they think they've been exposed to so many things, but it's only within the context of their within
Mm.
that realm, the scientific method in that box. Create a testable hypothesis, test it, and you figure it out. That's something that I realized. I thought, oh, I'd done so much neuroscience, I've done X, Y, Z, but I realized there's so much evidence also for
Mm.
something beyond. You know, science has been a very, like, it's been drastically changing day in and day out, but what they've been saying in the Shastras and Upanishads and even in the Abrahamic faiths and uh, have actually been very constant. I mean, they've been saying the same thing over and over again, day in and day out. And I think that I use actually the scientific method, or parts of the scientific method in my spiritual experience. So when I do conduct experiments, we run multiple conditions, and there's a lot of error, but there's
Mm.
also truth. There's also something which remains at the very end,
Mm.
and so that is what we report, because we have to do multiple experiments. I can't just run one experiment and say, okay, I found the truth. It meets a statistical significance. Boom, I publish it. You have to run multiple experiments. The same thing that I do with spirituality. I take lessons and I even test in my own life and other people's lives. And there's always a distillate at the very end,
Mm.
something that remains constant across different messages. And those are the kinds of things that I really hold myself to. And things like the idea of spirit, things like the idea of death and rebirth, things like the idea of a universal God always emerge in everything that we hear about in the sort of metaphysical realm.
Yeah.
And there's lots of evidence to support it. Unfortunately, they're not in peer-reviewed articles that's easily accessible to everybody, but I think it's getting there.
Man, I tell you, you have. I mean, right now I'm experiencing uh, a high. Just no, seriously, I'm just, man. That is amazing. Just differentiating that one thing you said, that are we the neurons, or are we the energy that's firing the neurons? That is an amazing perspective that is opening up a whole possibility and thought processes here. Because if I think of even what is spirit, you know, you can't describe. What if I just say the spirit is the energy?
Mhm.
It makes sense, you
Exactly.
know, because we even speak of spirit very in abstract manner. What is spirit? You can't touch it, you can't show it, but you can touch energy, you can feel energy,
Mhm.
you can constitute yourself as energy.
Right.
That makes sense, like I don't feel like or we coming back to another conversation we had about love,
Mhm.
energy,
Exactly.
it makes perfect sense. And the universe is what at least in the physicists have described it as nothing but energy in
Exactly.
different frequencies. And so what you're saying is I love that. I just love that. It's making a lot of sense to
I
me.
mean, Newton and his colleagues described matter and energy, what, in, like, I forgot the exact time, but it was recently. Hinduism described Prakriti and Purusha, basically
Yeah.
matter and energy. I mean, who knows how long ago?
Yeah.
And we've it's been repeatedly been saying that we are the sort of union between Prakriti and
Yeah.
Purusha. You see this in so many facets of Hinduism that I think, and that's the problem. I think religion is a good guiding post, but people get so focused on religion and miss the obvious messages that are sitting right there. The linga
Yeah,
is the union of two things.
because Hinduism is not a religion,
Right, right.
right?
I mean, even
When you
yeah, even all religions, even
Yeah.
Christianity and stuff like that, right? It's just that, like, that they basically said that the matter is lifeless without the energy that
Yeah.
impregnates it. And it's really hard to, I think, practically convert that. But I think things like neuroscience have given me an avenue to understand that. And given things like physics and stuff like that have really given me a sort of perspective to see that and broaden our way in how we define these things. Because conceptually, it could mean anything.
Yeah.
But
Yeah. In terms of practical use of this insight, right? It really boils down to empowerment. To me, it boils down to empowerment, that you're not what you wound up as. You're not just your memory that you have been accumulating for the last 10, 20, 30 years because of your circumstances. You are pure energy, and you can create new memory right now at this very moment. And that's the power of your existence. And that's what's, for me, most powerful.
Yes. And, in a way that we are actually completely in control of our own, we actually are completely in control of our own experiences, because like I said, with neuroplasticity, I just said that it's subject to change. And what did I said that the electrical and chemical signals, which, the energy which really connects both of those, allows things to be formed or unformed. And so, in a way, there's this beautiful construct of biology, which allows us to be in perfect control of what we actually want to experience. And we think that we are only restricted and limited and whatnot, but we're really not. And when we get to a point where we're too confined and we can't further change, at least we have an escape in death. And I don't necessarily see death as a bad thing. I see it as a transformation.
It's the energy release for the energy. It's a release for the energy that now can go figure out another substrate.
Absolutely.
This substrate is limiting, so we can find another one.
Absolutely.
That's an amazing.
And I mean, also, like, when you're talking about like who is the one making the decision to climb Mount Everest and kinds of things, it's also, I mean, like, oftentimes we're able to push way beyond what some people, some evolutionists take the approach that, why do we do certain things? Because they reduce it to an evolutionary phenomenon. Like, for example, why do we want to procreate? Why do we believe in God? They kind of reduce it to the fact that we want to reproduce. We use God as a means to connect with our peers. Like, it's like a sort of pack, mindset. But why it still fails to answer the question? Why is it that beyond any reason of any sort of rationale, we're not having any pleasant experience climbing? Sometimes it's just crazy. We're like putting ourselves through hell and back, yet we still feel like we have to do something. These kinds of questions are very difficult to address in the sort of plain, mundane view of the world, I think.
Yeah, I agree with you, and I think it makes it simple when you're able to articulate it in this fashion, because most rational people can understand that difference. That, okay, if I'm the physical substrate, I'm the neuron, there is energy coming from somewhere. It's not coming from within, it's coming from without. And that energy is a different domain versus the substrate that runs underneath. So
here's another thought experiment that I kind of posed to myself a little while ago, is the idea of thermodynamics. It has to relate to the idea of thermodynamics, and it comes back to the idea of energy. And so we're all taught in physics class very early on that obviously energy can be neither created nor destroyed, but also things move towards entropy. That things always move towards disorder, right? We always move towards disorder. But the brain is the exact, but the things that, so the way that things can oppose entropy is through only one way, is through information. There has to be a template. So if you want to go against disorder or chaos, there has to be a reason to go against it, which one could call information or reason or cause or whatever. So how can we create order from non-order? that's one of the fundamental questions that we've always answered. How can our human brain, which is a set box of, it has so much order to it, or human physiology, there's a lot of order. How can it have started from nothing or complete chaos? Because it wouldn't follow the law of entropy that way, right? So then again, it kind of made me think about the idea that maybe there is some order that we're not able to quite understand. Maybe there's things that don't fall into the clear-cut boundaries of start and end. That's another thing which is really hard for our minds to really understand. Is that we have to, as much as I want to think that I understand timelessness, I just can't. It doesn't make sense to me. I've accepted that. For a long time, I thought I understood timelessness, but I don't. It just doesn't make sense to me. But it can exist, right?
Yeah. The other thing is, while you're talking about chaos and order, if you from what I have read and heard, there is chaos at the subatomic level, right? There is a constant churn, there's constant movement of atoms and protons and electrons, and it's constantly. But it does. But at this level, at this macro view, it looks like it's all in order. But underneath, it's chaotic, right? Even at a cellular level, right now, as we speak, as you and I are speaking, our bodies are right now inside going through all kind of chaos.
Exactly.
And there is a higher order pattern that probably we are able to see. So I'm also thinking that if you're ready to look at the universe, and maybe this is a bit woo-woo here, and we at our level don't see that chaos and the order at that level. So there is a higher level order at the universal level, and there is chaos happening at our level, and that can be only visible at that level. Just like we see order at our level, and we don't see all the subatomic chaos. I don't know. I'm just
that is
maybe
exactly
blabbering
how,
here, but
that's exactly how I see it. That's exactly how I see it, and that's exactly how it's been proposed in so many different world religions. If you think about it, there's a connection. There is a link between every spatial and temporal scale of life that we can talk about. What do I mean by that? I'm not going to start at the subatomic level because I don't really know the physics behind it. But at each stage, there's a very fine connection between all of it. So we start at the cellular level, right? There's thousands of cells, sorry, not thousands of cells, say billions of cells in our human body, and they're all doing different things. But there's only one cell in your body that gets the opportunity to be translated into a human. That cell then gets transferred, and it then again merges with the other cell, from their side then merges, and then flash forward and it becomes a human. Right now, as humans, we think we're the end all be all, not end all be all, whatever, but we ascribe there's a lot of conflict. We're meaning, who are we, what are we doing, what's our purpose, et cetera, et cetera. But you're absolutely right. We have, we are actually, if we take a step back, we're a part of this earth. We're one of 100 subcomponents that constitute this thing we call Earth. And this is exactly how Hinduism actually describes this model. They ascribe personalities to planets, right, as consciousnesses. So then we start to zoom out further and further. So, humans constitute a community, communities constitute countries, countries constitute continents, continents constitute this thing we call the world. Then there's a planet, and then then that has its own consciousness, and then our solar system has its own consciousness. The galaxy has its own consciousness, and there's layers upon layers upon layers. We even see this reemerge idea of relativity, that the different consciousness experience time and space in different ways. We're talking about Brahmaloka. One day in Brahma is supposed to be something in the order of 200 million human years or something like that, right? So, Hinduism, again, describing special relativity far before Einstein ever described it. And basically, if we zoom out far enough, you're left with this singular consciousness, with this seemingly chaotic sub-constitution, but each one impregnated with this unbelievable meaning.
Mm.
And so I think that, I mean, I think we went a little far into the weeds here, but I mean, that's kind of the way that I see the world, and I think that's kind of how you were describing it.
Yeah.
What does this mean for us practically? I think for me, it's just, it gives me solace.
Mhm.
You just go about your duty.
Yeah.
Like sometimes I think it's so easy to get lost in the struggle of everyday
Mm.
life. And certain people look at it as a nihilism. It's like, oh, why does it then matter about anything? It still matters that you do what you need to do, because you may be that one cell that moves on, and you will be
Mm.
eventually. You will be that then moves forward. You know, it's just a matter of when you'll get there, when and how you'll be ready for it. It may take us, 1,000 life cycles, 1,000,000 life cycles, 1,000,000,000 life cycles, but we'll eventually get there, just like that one cell did, because it took us that much time to get here.
Mm.
You realize that? Like, it took us that much time to get here, we will make it there as well. And so it's just having that patience is I think the most important thing.
So when you say get there, what are you referring to?
So maybe even just this like migrate into those different spatial scales I was referring
Mm.
to. Maybe we will become a planet one day,
Mm.
right? But how do we do that? We have to die multiple times. We become a part of the Earth, and the Earth kind of to really fully take form as a planet. We have in our religion, we have astrology, and these planets are ascribed personalities with very detailed descriptions of what they do and who they are and what they act
Yeah.
and how they interact with each other. These
Yeah.
kinds of things, right? And based on their sort of activities, that informs us,
Yeah.
right? So you can equate that to how cells interact in our bodies. We feel a certain way. We can inform neuronal populations. We can inform the health of certain cells for us and things like that. And if certain cells don't do their duty and they persist to don't do what they do, they can become cancerous. They can become
Yeah.
pathological. They can disrupt the whole system. That only makes the whole situation even more difficult to deal with.
Yeah. Yeah.
We don't want to be cancerous cells.
Yeah. Yeah. No, absolutely. And I do want to, in my view, and not that it's a semantics. We keep using religion. I think none of what you're sharing, according to me, is just Indian thought. It's just a
Right.
generic Indian thought. We never categorized it as a religion, quote unquote religion. It was a part of the scientific thought in Indian civilization,
Mm-hmm.
and yeah, there were different schools of thought. There was different thinkers. There was also a section of the Indian thought that was materialistic, purely materialistic. I think
Absolutely.
it's called the
Shrinath.
Charvaka,
Okay. Yeah.
right? And there are also, on a lighter vein, completely joking, but there are some lighter vein comments about if that school of thought had won, we would have developed the atomic bomb and not the West, because we went down the path of spirit and metaphysics, and lost the war battle on the materialist, on the physical side. But jokes aside, the point being, a lot of this is ancient science or ancient thought that's there. And sometimes talking to you, who's a modern day scientist, who's trying to get that perspective, is very welcome.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll tell you what, like the sum of it is, without getting too far into the weeds, I'll just give you a personal perspective, because I've really been trying to understand who I am and what we're doing, and I feel like the brain isn't the only answer.
Hmm.
It's allows us it links us to this world, it allows us to interact with this world.
Yeah.
But at this point I would I wouldn't venture to say that we are our brains, we are our
Yeah.
we are a central nervous system, because I just, like, for all the reasons that I've given before, and there's, I think,
Yeah.
a whole laundry, like, sort of last 1.5 hours, we kind of spent talking about that. But there's a lot more, there's a lot more complexity to it. You lose a lot of the meaning. It just doesn't really make sense. A lot
Hmm.
of Christians will use this term in the sense that I have more evidence to believe that
Hmm.
we are not just that. It's not an absolute. It's more, do I have more evidence or have less evidence?
Hmm.
At this point, I have more evidence to suggest that we're something more than just our brains.
Yeah. Wonderful. Shri, that was a wide and deep conversation at the same time. And again, I will probably publish this as two separate episodes because
Sure.
they're two distinct domains. And but it was extremely fascinating and insightful, and I'm so glad to see someone in your age group, dwelling into something as broad and deep as this. And so the future generations can continue exploring this to the next level, and of course us.
Absolutely. I
So
sincerely
thank you.
hope so. Absolutely. Thank you so much again for the opportunity. It's been a real pleasure.
Thanks, Sri. I will let you go and enjoy the rest of the afternoon, and we'll stay in touch.
Sounds good. Thank you.
All right, bye.